Chapter 10 of The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution by William Cooper Nell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by the Progressing America Project. The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. Chapter 10. Maryland. Thomas Savoy, Thomas Hollen, John Moore, Benjamin Banneker, Francis Ellen Watkins. A correspondent of the New Orleans Picayune gives the following account of Thomas Savoy, a Negro veteran, as he was called. Quote, "Few persons, we think, have traveled in Texas who have not heard of Thomas Savoy, alias Black Tom, alias the special citizen of Bexar County. He was by trade a barber, but by inclination a soldier, and his history is intimately connected with the warlike part of that of Texas. He was much fonder, too, of the company of white men than that of persons of his own color. Tom was a native of Maryland, then a citizen of Washington, D.C., then a resident of Mississippi, whence he emigrated to Texas at the beginning of the Revolution with a company of Mississippi volunteers, his razor in his pocket and his gun on his shoulder. They joined General Houston shortly after the Battle of San Jacinto, but Black Tom's subsequent conduct as a soldier elicited the praise of his hard-fighting comrades and superior officers. The year 1839 was distinguished in Texan annals by the expedition under Jordan to Saltillo to assist the treacherous Canales in his armed Federalist attempt against the Mexican anti-Federalists. He betrayed his little band of Texan allies, but they and their gallant leader gave the United Federalists and the State Rights Mexican Army two as thorough consecutive drubbings as they ever received, and then returned leisurely home without interruption. Black Tom was one of Jordan's men, and if he had little occasion or time to use his razor, he made up for it by a skillful handling of his offensive weapons. In 1842, General Wool invaded Texas with the Mexican army and got a good beating at the Battle of Salito. Tom was in the midst of it and was wounded. He participated in several subsequent conflicts with the Indians, fighting bravely as usual. He followed his old Texan comrades under Taylor's banner and hurried along with them into the battle at Monterey. He was also in the memorable struggle of Buena Vista. Black Tom then returned to Texas with the Kentucky Volunteers, and after that, San Antonio became his headquarters. He was, of course, a general favorite, and lived like a lord, but the wandering spirit that 10 years in Texas had made second nature to him would now and then break out, and Black Tom would be missing. The next thing heard of him, he was at a frontier post, or far up in the Indian country, in the midst of danger. On the 15th of July, 1853, the body of a man was found 2 miles west of San Antonio. A coroner's inquest was held, and a verdict returned of came to his death from cause unknown. The body was that of Old Tom. Thomas Hollen, of Dorset County, Maryland, was in the Revolutionary War, attached to the regiment of Colonel Charles Goldsborough, and was wounded by a musket ball in the calf of his leg. He died in 1816, aged 72, at the town of Blackwood, New Jersey, and was buried in the Snow Hill churchyard east of Woodbury. He had an uncle who fought by his side in the same war. The Reverend James Hollen, of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, is a nephew of Thomas Hollen. John Moore was skipper of the sloop Roebuck, 110 tons, which was captured in Chesapeake Bay, between Spry and Poole's Islands, by the British 74 Dragon. He was placed on board the brig Bashaw, when, provoked by insolent treatment, he struck an officer with the tiller, for which he was detained in prison at Halifax for 18 months. The sloop and cargo were confiscated. Mr. Moore now resides in Newport, Rhode Island. Benjamin Banneker. Benjamin Banneker was born in Baltimore County, near the edge of Ellicott's Mills, in the year 1732. His father was a native African, and his mother the child of natives of Africa, so that, to no admixture of the blood of the white man was he indebted for his peculiar and extraordinary abilities. His father was a slave when he married, but his wife, who was a free woman, and possessed of great energy and industry, very soon afterwards purchased his freedom. Banneker's mother was named Morton before her marriage, and belonged to a family remarkable for its intelligence. When upwards of 70, she was still very active, and it is remembered of her that at this advanced age she made nothing of catching her chickens, when wanted, by running them down. A nephew of hers, Greenberry Morton, was a person of note, notwithstanding his complexion. Prior to 1809, free people of color, possessed of a certain property qualification, voted in Maryland. In that year, a law was passed, restricting the right of voting to free white males. Morton was ignorant of the law till he offered to vote at the polls in Baltimore County, and it is said that when his vote was refused, he addressed the crowd in a strain of pure and impassioned eloquence, which kept the audience that the election had assembled in breathless attention while he spoke. When Benjamin was old enough, he was employed to assist his parents in their labor. This was at an early age, when his destiny seemed nothing better than that of a child of poor and ignorant free Negroes, occupying a few acres of land in a remote and thinly peopled neighborhood, a destiny which, certainly, at this day, is not a very brilliant promise, and which, at the time in question, must have been gloomy enough. In the intervals of toil, and when he was approaching or had attained manhood, he was sent to an obscure and distant country school, which he attended until he had acquired a knowledge of reading and writing, and had advanced in arithmetic as far as double position. In all matters beyond these rudiments of learning, he was his own instructor. On leaving school, he was obliged to labor for years, almost uninterruptedly, for his support. But his memory being retentive, he lost nothing of the little education he had acquired. On the contrary, although utterly destitute of books, he amplified and improved his stock of arithmetical knowledge by the operation of his mind alone. He was an acute observer of everything that he saw, or which took place around him in the natural world, and he sought with avidity information from all sources of what was going forward in society, so that he became gradually possessed of a fund of general knowledge which it was difficult to find among those even who were far more favored by opportunity and circumstances than he was. At first, his information was a subject of remark and wonder among his illiterate neighbors only, but, by degrees, the reputation of it spread through a wider circle, and Benjamin Banneker, still a young man, came to be thought of as one who could not only perform all the operations of mental arithmetic with extraordinary facility, but exercise a sound and discriminating judgment upon men and things. It was at this time, when he was about 30 years of age, that he contrived and made a clock which proved to be an excellent timepiece. He had seen a watch, but not a clock, such an article not yet having found its way into the quiet and secluded valley in which he lived. The watch was, therefore, his model. It took him a good while to accomplish this feat, his great difficulty, as he often used to say, being to make the hour, minute, and second hands correspond in their motions. But the clock was finished at last, and raised still higher the credit of Banneker in his neighborhood as an ingenious man, as well as a good arithmetician. As already stated, the basis of Banneker's arithmetical knowledge was obtained from the schoolbook in which he had advanced as far as double position, but in 1787, Mr. George Ellicott sent him Mayer's tables, Ferguson's astronomy, and Leadbetter's lunar tables. Along with these books were some astronomical instruments. Mr. Ellicott was accidentally prevented from giving Banneker any information as to the use of either books or instruments at the time he lent them, but, before he again met him, and the interval was a brief one, Banneker was independent of any instruction, and was already absorbed in the contemplation of the new world, which was thus opened to his view. From this time, the study of astronomy became the great object of his life, and, for a season, he almost disappeared from the sight of his neighbors. Very soon after the possession of the books already mentioned had drawn Banneker's attention to astronomy, he determined to compile an almanac, that being the most familiar use that occurred to him of the information he had acquired. Of the labor of the work, few of those who can form an estimate, who would at this day commence such a task, with all the assistance afforded by accurate tables and well-digested rules. Banneker had no such aid, and it is narrated as a well-known fact that he had commenced and had advanced far in the preparation of the logarithms necessary for his purpose when he was furnished with a set of tables by Mr. George Ellicott. About this time, he began the record of his calculations, which is still in existence, and is left with the Society for examination. The first almanac which Banneker prepared, fit for publication, was for the year 1792. By this time, his acquirements had become generally known, and among others who took an interest in him was James McHenry, Esquire. Mr. McHenry wrote a letter to Goddard and Angel, then the almanac publishers in Baltimore, which was probably the means of procuring the publication of the first almanac. In their editorial notice, Messrs. Goddard and Angel say, They feel gratified in the opportunity of presenting to the public, through their press, what must be considered as an extraordinary effort of genius, a complete and accurate ephemeris for the year 1792, calculated by a sable descendant of Africa," etc. And they further say, "that they flatter themselves that a philanthropic public, in this enlightened era, will be induced to give their patronage and support to his work, not only on account of its intrinsic merits, it having met the approbation of several of the most distinguished astronomers of America, particularly the celebrated Mr. Rittenhouse, but from similar motives, to those which induced the editors to give this calculation the preference, the ardent desire of drawing modest merit from obscurity, and controverting the long-established illiberal prejudice against the blacks." The motives alluded to by Goddard and Angel, in the extracts just quoted, of doing justice to the intellect of the colored race, were a prominent object with Banneker himself, and the only occasions when he overstepped a modesty which was his peculiar characteristic were, when he could, by doing so, "controvert the long-established illiberal prejudice against the blacks." We find him, therefore, sending a copy of his first almanac to Mr. Jefferson, the Secretary of State under General Washington, with an excellent letter, to which Mr. Jefferson made the following reply: Philadelphia, August 31st, 1791. Sir, I thank you sincerely for your letter of the 19th instant, and for the almanac it contained. Nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit, that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of the other colors of men, and that the appearance of a want of them is owing only to the degraded condition of their existence, both in Africa and America. I can add, with truth, that no one wishes more ardently to see a good system commenced for raising the condition, both of their body and mind, to what it ought to be, as fast as the imbecility of their present existence, and other circumstances which cannot be neglected, will admit. I have taken the liberty of sending your almanac to Monsieur de Condorcet, Secretary of the Academy of Sciences, at Paris, and members of the Philanthropic Society, because I considered it a document to which your whole color had a right, for their justification, against the doubts which have been entertained of them. I am, with great esteem, sir, your most obedient servant, Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Benjamin Banneker, near Ellicott's Lower Mills, Baltimore County. When he published his first almanac, Banneker was 59 years old, and had high respect paid to him, by all the scientific men of the country, as one whose color did not prevent his belonging to the same class, as far as intellect went with themselves. After the adoption of the Constitution in 1789, commissioners were appointed to run the lines of the District of Columbia, the 10 miles square now occupied by the seat of government, and then called the Federal Territory. The commissioners invited Banneker to be present at the runnings, and treated him with much consideration. Banneker continued to calculate and publish his almanacs until 1802, and the folio already referred to and now before the Society contains the calculations clearly copied, and the figures used by him in his work. The handwriting, it will be seen, is very good, and remarkably distinct, having a practised look, although evidently that of an old man, who makes his letters and figures slowly and carefully. His letter to Mr. Jefferson gives a very good idea of his style and composition, and his ability as a writer. The title of the almanac is here transcribed at length, as a matter of curious interest at this latter day. If it claims little of the art, and elegance, and wit of the almanacs of Punch or of Hood, it is, nevertheless, considering its history, a far more surprising product. Benjamin Banneker's Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, and Maryland Almanac and Ephemeris, for the year of our Lord 1792, being by sextile or leap year, and the 16th year of American independence, which commenced July 4th, 1776, containing the motions of the sun and moon, the true places and aspects of the planets, the rising and setting of the sun, and the rising, setting, and southing, place and age of the moon, etc., the lunations, conjunctions, eclipses, judgment of the weather, festivals, and remarkable days. In 1804, Banneker died, in the 72nd year of his age, and his remains are deposited, without a stone to mark the spot, near the dwelling which he occupied during his lifetime. During the whole of his long life, he lived respectably, and much esteemed by all those who became acquainted with him, but more especially by those who could fully appreciate his genius and the extent of his acquirements. Although his mode of life was regular and extremely retired, living alone, having never married, cooking his own victuals and washing his own clothes, and scarcely ever being absent from home, yet there was nothing misanthropic in his character, for a gentleman who knew him thus speaks of him, quote, "I recollect him well. He was a brave-looking, pleasant man, with something very noble in his appearance. His mind was evidently much engrossed in his calculations, but he was glad always to receive the visits which we often paid to him." End quote. Another of Mr. Ellicott's correspondents writes as follows, quote, "When I was a boy, I became very much interested in him, Banneker, as his manners were those of a perfect gentleman, kind, generous, hospitable, humane, dignified and pleasing, abounding in information on all the various subjects and incidents of the day, very modest and unassuming, and delighting in society at his own house. I have seen him frequently. His head was covered with a thick suit of white hair, which gave him a very venerable and dignified appearance. His dress was uniformly of superfine drab broadcloth, made in the old style of a plain coat, with a straight collar and long waistcoat, and a broad-brimmed hat. His color was not jet black, but decidedly negro. In size and personal appearance, the statue of Franklin, at the library in Philadelphia, as seen from the street, is a perfect likeness of him." End quote. The foregoing account of Mr. Banneker is taken from a memoir, read before the Historical Society of Maryland, by John H. B. Latrobe, which was undoubtedly published to serve the purposes of the American Colonization Society. The Rev. John T. Raymond, a distinguished colored Baptist clergyman, issued an edition of the pamphlet, in the preface to which he says, quote, "I have snatched it from there, the colonizationists' foul purpose, in order to produce a contrary effect. Our people are now too wise to be entangled in their meshes." End quote. Francis Ellen Watkins. Maryland has not only produced gifted colored men, but has contributed a fair proportion of women who have proved good their claim to equality. Francis Ellen Watkins, born in Baltimore, has contended with 1,000 disadvantages from early life, and though now a young woman, is actively engaged, on her own responsibility, as an anti-slavery lecturer in the Eastern States. She has published a small volume of poems, which certainly are very creditable to her, both in a literary and moral point of view, and indicate the possession of a talent, which, if carefully cultivated and properly encouraged, cannot fail to secure for herself a poetic reputation, and to deepen the interest, already so extensively felt, in the liberation and enfranchisement of the entire colored race. I make the following brief extracts from her book, which is entitled, quote, "Poems and Miscellaneous Writings by Francis Ellen Watkins." End quote. Eliza Harris. Like a fawn from the arrow, startled and wild, a woman swept by us, bearing a child. In her eye was the night of a settled despair, and her brow was overshadowed with anguish and care. She was nearing the river, in reaching the brink. She heeded no danger, she paused not to think. For she is a mother, her child is a slave, and she'll give him his freedom, or find him a grave. But she's free, yes, free, from the land where the slave, from the hand of oppression must rest in the grave, where bondage and torture, where scourges and chains, have placed on our banner indelible stains. The bloodhounds have missed the scent of her way, the hunter is rifled and foiled of his prey. Fierce jargon and cursing, with clanking of chains, make sounds of strange discord on liberty's plains. With the rapture of love and fullness of bliss, she placed on his brow a mother's fond kiss. O poverty, danger, and death she can brave, for the child of her love is no longer a slave. Christianity. Christianity is a system claiming God for its author, and the welfare of man for its object. It is a system so uniform, exalted and pure, that the loftiest intellects have acknowledged its influence and acquiesced in the justness of its claims. Genius has bent from his erratic course to gather fire from her altars, and pathos from the agony of Gethsemane and the sufferings of Calvary. Philosophy and science have paused, amid their speculative researches and wondrous revelations, to gain wisdom from her teachings and knowledge from her precepts. Poetry has culled her fairest flowers and wreathed her softest, to bind her author's bleeding brow. Music has strung her sweetest lyres, and breathed her noblest strains, to celebrate his fame, whilst learning has bent from her lofty heights to bow at the lowly cross. The constant friend of man, she has stood by him in his hour of greatest need. She has cheered the prisoner in his cell, and strengthened the martyr at the stake. She has nerved the frail and shrinking heart of woman for high and holy deeds. The worn and weary have rested their fainting heads upon her bosom, and gathered strength from her words, and courage from her counsels. She has been the staff of decrepit age, and the joy of manhood in its strength. She has bent over the form of lovely childhood, and suffered it to have a place in the Redeemer's arms. She has stood by the bed of the dying, and unveiled the glories of eternal life, gilding the darkness of the tomb with the glory of the resurrection. End of chapter 10.